Let's get started again for the I was about to say the heckling portion of our proceeding, not heckling the question or the sort of summation and question and answer period. Leading our discussion this afternoon is Dr. Inga Riest. Inga is the director of the Frick Collection Center for the History of Collecting and the chief of research collections and programs at the Frick Art Reference Library in New York. Her PhD from Columbia University focused on Veronese's work in the Villa Barbaro at Mazères, and she was a contributor to the catalog of our Veronese exhibition here at the Ringling. She also recently contributed to the exhibition catalog for Masterpieces of European Painting from the Cleveland Museum of Art at the Frick in 2006, as well as, I love this title, All the World's a Stage, the Theater Conceit in Early Modern Italy, for the Blackwell Companion to Renaissance and Baroque Art of 2012. She's the co-editor of Provenance, an alternative art history, and has written countless essays on the history of collecting, including most recently Sacred Art in the Profane New World of 19th Century America, in Sacred Possessions, Collecting Italian Religious Art 1500 to 1900, and Helen Clay Frick, Charting Her Own Course in Power Underestimated, American Women Art Collectors. We're delighted that Inga has volunteered to sort of sum up our day and also lead us in song, lead us in questioning our speakers about all of their wonderful papers and to learn a little more about Veronese. Inga.
Thank you, Virginia. I think this will be a bit of a tag team effort with David Rosand and myself, but I'm here to begin. I wouldn't insult all of you by thinking that you hadn't listened attentively, so I'm not going to stand here and say, well, what you heard Tracy say is the following, because you heard Tracy not that long ago. So rather what I'm going to do, and I'm doing it very much on the fly, by the way, because I did not see these papers in advance, so I've been learning with you and have enjoyed every minute of it. I can't thank Virginia enough for organizing such a rich and wonderful symposium, and I can't thank all of you enough for presenting such clear and stimulating papers. It's really been a wonderful day. I think I'll just say kind of 4 or 5 points that where I've noticed commonalities, and then we can get into all of the questioning and grappling. But I do think that there are threads that can be drawn together through this tapestry of Veronese's work, and so I'll go on with them. First of all, I think Virginia and Frederick have really succeeded in persuading all of us, if we needed persuading, which I don't think very many of us did, that the only thing that might be shallow about Veronese is the space on which he deployed his figures. He clearly was an artist fully engaged with the depth of humanist thinking in his time that was common to virtually all of his patrons. One thing I like to harp on for people studying the mid-16th century from the point of view of the 21st century is to remind everyone that a learned man or woman, if she chose, really could have read everything. Just everything. So there were free associations and common philosophical inquiries could be drawn by everyone in a similar manner. And I think that conjures an atmosphere for intellectual exchange and mutual nourishment that we really don't have the pleasure of enjoying anymore in the age of Google. So I think that's something to always keep in mind. And Veronese very evidently participated in all of this. I think we saw that especially in the way he reveled in the multiple layers of iconographic meaning, especially with the image of the state. So we saw how Venetia could evolve and be adapted and transformed, and how he could inspire so many other artists, even to my revelation to me, manuscript artists in expanding and rethinking the image of the state. He reveled as much in the multiple layers of iconographic potential in religious narrative, as Frederick has shown us, and as did other speakers, and the conjoining and restraining that Stephen indicated could enter into mythological scenes as much as fresco decorations and religious scenes. So he really was an intellectually rich and engaged artist from every point of view, and I think every single paper we heard today reinforced that. Another common thread I would think we noticed, maybe not in every paper, but in many, is that arguably Veronese was a multimedia artist. He wasn't Raphael or Michelangelo or a proto-Bernini in that he wasn't a practitioner in every single one of those media, but he was an architect, he was a scene designer, he was a sculptor, and of course he was a painter par excellence. And he thought in the way a multimedia artist would think. And that is something that perhaps sets him apart from the stereotype of the Venetian painter that we grasp from Vasari and others. We saw that he is also an innovator and an experimenter. That was true in his architecture, that, as Tracy so clearly showed us, certainly in his fictive stuccos that we saw in C.D. Dickerson's paper, and as Susanna showed us so lucidly, in his small-scale panels. He took in hand the opportunity to explore and press the boundaries to a considerable degree, and so there we have the innovative side of his personality. And even within that context, though, he had a remarkable respect for decorum, even if he was pushing the envelope. We saw this at San Sebastiano, where he would have the arrows shooting across the nave, and yet superficially the figures adhere to any sort of more or less standard decorum that is required. And we also learned that Paolo Peruta's kind of exhortations for what is appropriate for feast scenes and other specific scenes were things that were design elements and compositional elements that Veronese would respect. Let me see, what else do I have here? I was wondering actually about what John would think about the multiple originals and the shop work. I'll get more into that, but how Veronese's innovations in compositional reworkings of the same theme, whether it be the baptism or the dead Christ, was that a way to have multiple originals that could also have a didactic purpose for his shop, his family, and we'll probably have more to say about that. I think another thing that comes through in all of today's talks is that Veronese really was the quintessential Venetian artist, even though he came from the terra firma and was very much informed, as I certainly expound all the time, on by his Roman past and the Roman heritage of the not only of Verona but of the cities he visited in his youth, and San Michele Falconese Cornetto, the formative influences of his early career. And yet, eventually, he came to understand Venice better than just about anyone, and nowhere is that more in evidence than the way he treats the image of Venetia herself. What a contrast that was with the Duke Cosimo of Florence there, and being apotheosized as compared to the state. I thought that was really a fantastic juxtaposition. And there too we see that that his workshop embraced this very much. And then the last point I thought would be worth our speakers all exploring more is Paolo's legacy, both in his own time, which was so beautifully put forward in Helena's paper about the manuscript, the Commissione, and in John's with his workshop, but also Tiepolo and onwards beyond even that. I think that it's possible to turn the workshop notion into a real positive when you think about what he gave, as all the Venetian artists did within that family workshop tradition, what he gave to the eredi Veronese, because he did, I don't think he quashed their creativity necessarily, and that's something that might be an important thing too. I have a few questions that I could pose if other people don't have them, but I think I'll hold off. I know David Rosand has been taking notes as well, and it would be wise for us to hear his thoughts in a summary context as well.
I too have questions to the individual speakers, but I was struck by certain themes that came out in the course of the symposium. And the first one was invention. And Susanna raised it with regard to the domestic decorative, so-called decorative, I have to put that in scare quotes now from now on, the domestic pictures. And I tried to raise that with regard to the chiaroscuro drawings, and Stephen raised it as well within the context of what can be called, according to 16th century values, the corporal eloquence of Veronese figures, the way in which the gestures and basically work out there. So the inventiveness of this painter, and we use the word loosely but also profoundly, I mean, constantly searching the subject matter. That was one thing that I was impressed by, because it came out in various ways. The other thing that Stephen raised, that is something that a number of people have been beginning to think more seriously about, and this again had to do with the profundity of Veronese, is the number of the imagery that deals with action that takes place off stage, but not by sight. The miracles that are not there, but they're somewhere else. And that again has to do with the way in which Veronese orchestrates, or better still, choreographs his figures. And then finally, the third point has to do with the longue durée that Carolyn raised. I mean, this, I think, is extremely important, and it's something that takes us back into the workshop, which was basically, one might say, the basic structural foundation for that longue durée, for the long tradition, the Serenissima, the Republic that lasts until Napoleon puts an end to it in 1797. That was sustained in all sorts of ways by laws that were no longer quite relevant by the 18th century. But one of the things that continued through absolutely every major painter in the Venetian tradition was the family workshop. And that family workshop takes us back to what John was talking about, excuse me, namely the relationship of the master to his heirs. And so when we talk about the style, we talk about teaching members of the workshop to paint alla Veronese or alla Tiziano or alla Tintoretto. What we're talking about basically, in each case, was the painter looking to the future of his family operation. And this was an important part of the whole guild system in Venice, and it takes us right through to the Tiepolo, to Guardi, and so forth. And this, I think, is another aspect that needs to be recognized when we talk about workshop, that it is sustained by the state, in the sense that the state offers all sorts of possibilities to, for example, the sons and daughters, actually, in the case of Tintoretto, to participate not only in the workshop, but to forego certain kinds of apprenticeship, because they're right there in the middle of things. So there's a wonderful social complexity here that ultimately accounts for, that ultimately sustains this longue durée that takes us from, in our case, from Veronese up to Tiepolo. Questions I'll hold for later.
As I say, I have a few questions, but I think it's only fair that our speakers be given the opportunity to ask one another a few questions that you've been each performing on your own. So let me just open it up to all of you first.
So when did decoration get a bad name? Because if you think about it, this is something that I have thought about in terms both of architectural vocabulary, where think of H.H. Richardson and his distrust of ornament. Yet ornament is the element that is a part of architecture that is its expressive quality. Decoration is a word that comes from the root of decorum. So how does that somehow become transformed into something that seems superficial?
Exactly.
Anybody?
Possibly.
It's on.
It is on. I would say it's kind of like a moment in modernism. Before Adolf Loos says ornament is crime, we have Berenson separating figures who represent significance, who are just like artists who create significance in the figure, versus mere decorators, mere superficial kind of painters. There's like a his Florentine painters of the Renaissance. It's a two-tier kind of things. There are the Botticellis and the Michelangelos, and then there are the Benozzo Gozzolis, and everybody else. This would be one thing. Yeah, I can't think what. Yeah,
Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
No, that's.
I mean, I wonder, as you asked the question, whether it isn't earlier, and thinking about the debate over Poussin versus Rubens in the French Academy, and the colorist, the decorative, the painting miles of canvas Rubens versus the intellectual Poussin, whether it's not grounded in that. I mean, that sounds an awful lot like Picasso versus Matisse and many other such distinctions between the intellectual and the decorative painter.
Well, I think there's a strong link between the French Academy and the English Academy and Reynolds.
I think the Academy.
Absolutely. Yeah. Right. So with the rise of
But it's before that, I think. The name that hasn't come up enough here, or hasn't come up at all, is Boschini. When Boschini calls him the treasurer of painting, when he talks about the colors as jewels, and he's already setting the stage, as it were, for what ultimately will culminate in Michael Levy saying that Veronese has no sense whatsoever of religious meaning, or worst of all, if I may say so, Sidney Friedberg.
So no matter how far back we go, we blame the scholars.
I was just going to add there, I think it's probably, and Susanna alluded to this, kind of sexism as well, that if decorative painting is kind of feminine and little things that go on pieces of furniture, I think that's probably part of it, is that it takes things that are seductive or appealing clearly can't have any depth, and that gets back to the Rubens.
Yeah,
and
I mean,
Poussin.
Sebastiano proposing to paint the Last Judgment Wall of the Sistine in oil mural, and Michelangelo telling him that that's an arte di donna, whereas only true fresco is a masculine way of painting, which actually gets us back to a Venetian versus Central Italian way of thinking about things.
But then the question of decoration isn't really just a question of scale. I mean, if Veronese is being tarred as being a decorative painter and working on an absolutely enormous scale, I mean, the scale is significant, but it's, I think, like Tiepolo, yeah.
I think a lot of it has to do with the academies, because in the Ancien Régime, at exactly the time when the French Academy was being founded, the patrons, the Marquis de Marigny and everyone else, were patronizing the peintres du bois, who might do decorative work as well. And with modernism, Picasso was doing ceramics as well as monumental works. And so I think it's more in the judgment of the academicians that
right, who also create hierarchies.
Who create hierarchies, exactly. I think that it may not be among the artists. Other questions for each other?
So what about Sebastiano Ricci, Caroline?
I know.
I want the Neo-Veronesian revival to start earlier.
Yeah, you're right. That's a very good point. I mean, another exhibition. But it is funny because, I mean, just thinking back at the way we look at these things, when I was a student in London, there was this great exhibition. One year there was an exhibition of Poussin at the Royal Academy, and the next year, or maybe it was the year before, there was an exhibition called the sort of, it wasn't called the Glory of Venice, it was meant to be the end of Venice, and it was about the 18th century. And it's still difficult to get out of these paradigms when we're looking at this period. But yes, I mean, maybe everyone's looking at Veronese. Sebastiano Ricci certainly is as well too. Yeah.
I actually had a question for you, Tracy, for Tracy and Caroline, in that Tiepolo seems to be getting away from the all'antica, the authenticity, if you will, of Veronese's all'antica approach, certainly to architecture and even to space, because he leads us into a deeper space more often than not, rather than the shallow deployment that Veronese uses. And I wondered how you see Tiepolo's, well, I guess to some degree you were saying that Tiepolo is reviving Veronese rather more than he's reviving the Roman past or reinterpreting it, so perhaps, but just wondered your...
I would agree with you. I think that's what he is doing, but I'm also very interested in what he thinks he might be doing in terms of history and what history might mean, and not simply in terms of history painting, but in where he sees himself in the sort of, you know, in the past of Venice. I don't really know if I have an answer, but that's the thing that really interests me and perplexes me about his work.
You have an architectural specialist, and so who controlled the exact elements? For example, the parapet was very much probably contemporary architecture, rather than, you know, with the kind of almost Oriental style stone trabeation, compared to the very, the invented classical of Palladio. Although I started worrying about whether Veronese did everything, and or who did it.
I mean, there is the notion out there in the scholarship that Benedetto was the architecture specialist.
Yep.
And I simply don't know what to make of the argument, to be perfectly honest. But was it Paolo who is so keyed in, or was Benedetto some genius in these scenographic spaces who kind of added them? Because they often don't appear in the drawings, as has been observed. And they're not part of the conception of the picture necessarily.
It seems to me, though, one of the things that brings up, thinking about some of the Rubens that were shown too, is the difference between a family workshop that is trying to produce a Veronese or a Titian or a Tintoretto, and a workshop like Rubens, which has specialists. And so, are we there yet? With really having that. You do have quadratura specialists in this period, but
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, there's no evidence that I can think of off the top of my head, but I would fully expect that there would be the guy who was better at draperies and the guy who was better at head and hands in that workshop. I mean, every other workshop where we do have documentation, although admittedly most of it starts in the 17th century, has drapery specialists foliage specialists and architecture specialists and so on.
The I think that Paolo was the architect. I mean, I think the architectural imagination was his. And, you know, things change. It's, when you get to the 18th century, had Tiepolo gone to England with all the Palladian material, he probably would have been producing much more archaeologically ambitious architecture, and we might not have liked it as much.
But wait, isn't though by the 18th century ancient Roman architecture is not exciting enough? I mean, it's kind of a done deal. It's like after 1500, people stopped doing checkerboard pavements to show perspective because they've got it. You know, the thing has been revived and it's achieved, and so you don't need to keep doing it. You can sort of put it in the background.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you know.
No, but I'm talking about the kind of geographic buildings. I mean, they're brand new in Veronese's lifetime, and they're kind of old hat by Tiepolo maybe, and so you don't need to kind of put your effort into recreating it.
But Vitruvian studies are, you know, at their height with Veronese, and by the time we get to the 18th century, they've been academicized and anglicized, with all due respect.
Yeah. No, I mean, I do wonder about the 18th century, and I have this pet project, which I'll get to one of these days, about all of those allegorical tombs that Owen McSweeney commissioned from all of the 18th century Venetian artists for the British, and how this and this all plays together, and the understanding of architecture and ruins, not just in Tiepolo, who tends to be discussed in a kind of isolation, but as part of that bigger culture of the time, and especially with the intermingling of the English influences. But alas, this is a project I haven't done yet.
Other questions of each other?
I have a very particular question, and I might as well take advantage of the fact that I have the mic in my hand, to Helena. In the Commissione of Alisi di Lorenzo Tiepolo,
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
there's that votive image where the portrait is not fully
Yes,
finished.
it's strange. Yes.
And he's accompanied by faith and charity.
Mm-hmm.
Is he hope?
Oh, I've never thought of that, but.
And to whom are they kneeling?
Well, they're kneeling, strangely enough, to Sant'Alvise, his name saint. But it is a strange construction because typically it would be the Virgin and Child, or.
I mean, I always look for my, you know, Trinitarian groupings.
Oh.
Yeah, why is it too
Very interesting. I'll have to look into that. Thank you.
Just wanted to add one thing about it. A nice point that John made about often there's a kind of geographic snobism that is geographic snobbery. If something's in an out-of-the-way place, it can't be important, or must be there for good reason, right? And that you know the important dynastic collections, you know, like the Prado or Vienna, they'll have the real one, and the less important one will be somewhere, say, in the New World. But there's another way to turn that around, though. Also, there's a sense of, you know, as curators, we want to sometimes fight for it's the same painting, but we want to fight for the attribution, and we're happy when someone takes off the end workshop. We feel kind of a sense of relief or pride, and how we're disappointed when it's put on. And what's interesting, though, is also the sense that you have to defend something more willingly if you're further out. I mean, if you're the academia, you can lose a whole bunch of Veroneses to attributionists, and you still have the greatest collection. And so, you know, the painting that would be in the storage in the academia would be hung with pride on the wall of the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, would be this star painting in the Princeton University Art Museum, and the subject every semester of student essays. So even though we're talking about the same painting, you know, the context really matters also. You know, I would feel, I think as a Tintoretto specialist, I have to say personally feel a little harsh if I were to demote someone's only Tintoretto. But if it's a place that has a bunch, you know, and this is the problem, because it sounds hilarious, but, you know, you make these decisions, I mean, these things are quite interesting. They're very psychological. If you're going through, and Virginia and I had a bit of this on the show, said, okay, well, we're going to not have that one, not have that one, not have that one, and then you kind of think, well, you better take the next one, because you've just demoted 3, or you've excluded them from your exhibition, or your comparative list of illustrations, or your checklist. So, I mean, there's a kind of psychology that is important, really a psychology of human frailty in a way, that I think needs to be brought into thinking about connoisseurship.
I just echo that with the attention to context, and when an exhibition is going to be centered around Veronese and workshop,
then it is appropriate in those instances to discuss with lenders and to begin to, carve out certain phrases and label copy that gives attention to that. And we faced that with the Bernini exhibition, because this is one where we're really trying to parse hands with these models. And Detroit now sadly has a Bernini and workshop model, even though it's labeled as Bernini in Detroit. And I encourage Alan Dara to continue to label it as Bernini, because it was definitely shown to Pope Alexander VII as an autographed Bernini. But it wasn't made by him. So I feel in the exhibition it's fine to have the workshop label, but that we do have a job as curators to begin to educate our public about what these objects really are when they're standalone in the permanent collection.
I just wanted to make a point about the issue that John raised of technical evidence, because often we now see increasingly technical evidence being produced as the holy grail, sort of technical evidence, in inverted commas, will prove something. As you pointed out, it often proves nothing at all. And I mean, I wanted to wonder, and I'm very keen on technical evidence, I do lots of it, but I'm also aware of its difficulties, and I wanted to push up to the point to you, John. I mean, do you think that the way in which we look at technical art history is just another form of connoisseurship, almost? I mean, do we use it in that way, or do you see them as distinct?
Well, I mean, I think it varies person to person and museum to museum. I think that technical evidence should be a part of modern connoisseurship. I think to try to make connoisseurial pronouncements and not incorporate the evidence leads one down a dangerous path, where you wind up looking silly and find out that the painting you promoted as a masterpiece was painted with titanium white in this 19th century production, for example. So I think it's essential that it be considered, and I think technical evidence can often disprove many things, but it never, it is too often treated as a kind of holy grail. And, some of us might be slightly, I'm going to get in trouble with the webcast again, some of us might be slightly skeptical when, for example, every painting cleaned by the Met suddenly is announced as being as an unknown masterpiece, or hitherto unobserved masterpiece by the artist. I think there's a reason, there's a due skepticism that might be attached to some of these notions. And I'm generally an expansionist on attributions, but yes, I mean, I do think that it is not the final word in any way.
And a related point also is that, people, scholars of all types and curators get letters in the mail. Like, I think my family owns a Titian, but it's now filtered down so that everybody now will send me, I think my family owns a Tintoretto, and there'll be an X-ray and all sorts of comparatives, indeed entire binders of detail photographs and such, as if the sheer volume of information can prove the point. And woe would be someone's eye who would contravene that.
There was a lesson that many of us, I think, learned way back at a Giorgione exhibition in 1978 or 9 in Castelfranco that was primarily made up of photographs and X-rays. And we art historians were parading around, looking at the X-rays, reading the X-rays, and declaring them to prove our attribution, Giorgione or not, and so forth. Now, reading an X-ray is an extremely difficult thing to do, and art historians really have to learn to be very, very modest and cautious. But the same is true here. I mean, when you look at the X-rays, you get sometimes, you just get a mess up there that tells you that something changed, but not much else. And that's I think, a dangerous thing. Then there was a time not too long ago when exhibition catalogs were filled with pages and pages of paint samples and paint cross sections, and you tried to read them, and then again, art historians would step in and say, this is whatever yellow or orange it was, and therefore it is by. And it was an incredible thing. We were seduced into thinking that we could learn all of this very, very quickly by looking at the reproductions. The way to do it, in effect, is to be in the laboratory with the people. And I mean, one of the great things that Frederick and I enjoy now is working with, say, Venice, and going back with the restorers and going into the pictures with them. And they're not concerned about about attributions. They're concerned about how the picture was made, and that's what's really important.
I think that seduction came when connoisseurship became so unfashionable, untrustworthy, or untrusted. Any bit of what seemed like firm evidence, any verbal evidence, any document, any signature, any scientific evidence suddenly gained a priority over that slippery evidence of what your eye told you. And so there's the kind of reaching for that. And I think that still exists in many ways. I think we are skeptical still of connoisseurial judgments because they can't be proven.
Yes. Pronounced by a scientist will make the New York Times below the fold, but not many pronounced by art historians. So Michelangelo painted a brainstem, the creation of Adam.
Right.
Everybody gets to look at it.
Yeah.
Well, but you could also use the analogy, though, that that conservators and technical scientists are very much like doctors, and that you use lots of technical evidence and machines, and you get second opinions on how you're going to treat something. But for an art historian to make an argument, it's much more like the law. I mean, there is no such thing as truth. You just try to convince your peers or a jury or a judge. And so you line up all your evidence, and so you try to make the best case for something being by some certain artist or with a certain title or a story or a chronology or something. And I think what's interesting is that these two things work in parallel, but the final judgment, is very much one of trying to convince. And if you don't, then you're the solitary voice.
And the legal metaphor is an interesting one, because then you have what's the standard of proof? Is it the American beyond a reasonable doubt, or is it the more common European preponderance of evidence gets you to where you're going?
Unanimous acquittal.
Yeah. The catalog.
Yeah.
What I think should be a goal is a proper language, a descriptive analytical language. I mean, when we're talking about subjective responses to the surface of a painting, I mean, if we could find a critical language that would describe the brushwork adequately so that we could actually share our intuitions, I won't call it knowledge, but our instincts with one another, we might find some more common ground for arriving at an attribution.
We should pause for a moment to ask if there are questions from the audience.
You touched on the fact that Veronese was very multimedia, and his involvement with the theater was touched on, and I was wondering if maybe you could expand a little bit more on that. Maybe his work with the theater, or maybe, obviously he was informed by biblical writings and, classic, the Roman stories and all that. Maybe how was he informed by other forms of the word or involvement with theater, that sort of thing?
This is an issue that comes up often, the assumption being somehow that the painters are responsive to theater. And I think it has to be reversed. It's the painters who invent theater. It's the painters who invent perspective that allows the establishment of a proscenium arch, the window through which you look and so forth, and to create the illusion of a city behind, whether it's Ferrara, Mantua, or whatever. So that it's Veronese's involvement, as with other painters, they were doing the sets, and from we have some documentation for this, and they presumably were all, as we know from Veronese, they were doing the costumes. And the two things go together. We don't have very much in the way of treatises on painting that talk about it, but the theatrical treatises of the 16th century do, and talk about the magnificence of costume and so forth, and talk about I used the term before, corporal eloquence, eloquenza corporale. This was something that comes out of a theatrical treatise in the 16th century, but it basically is responding to something that one would have learned from painting, how the body speaks, And that's what actors would be doing. And the whole idea of, I mean, if you look at the costume designs for the Edipo Tirano here in the exhibition, they're very briefly noted by Veronese, and then Maganza presumably will pick them up and develop them. But there's enough notation there to indicate that this is a uomo nobile, and he has to be dressed in a certain sense. So there's a going back to decorum. But I obviously, as you can tell, I'm an agent for the painters, having priority in almost all of this. I mean, they're the ones who quite literally set the stage, make it possible, and basically teach the actors how to behave. Yes, please.
I will be an agent for the patrons. Not that I dispute a word that David just said, but the theater was ubiquitous for these people. I mean, performances were in front of the loggie of the buildings during Carnival. You read the diaries of Marino Sanudo, and at certain times of year, the theater was, in a sense, a way of life. And the metaphors, I mean, there are these images of picture to yourself a grand theater as only nature can make. And this is certainly Palladio's reference point from Pliny for his Villa Rotunda, and arguably the Villa Mazere is itself a Scene Franz. And so there's the literal theater with the performances in the Teatro Olimpico, but there's also the thinking about the theater that is constant for these people who just are engaged with that kind of outlook all the time. Giulio Camillo was regarded as one of the greatest geniuses of a slightly earlier time, hired by Francis I of France. Nobody's even heard of him today. But this is something that was just ever present in these people's lives, especially the patrons, and then those needs or yearnings were answered by the painters.
I would also add that along with that kind of activity, that these artists, painters, sculptors, architects, patrons, in addition to these fixed programs that we've talked about, were employed for ephemeral triumphs and processions and entries and those kinds of temporary decorations were very much the whole city as a stage set. So in addition to individual palaces and their courtyards or villas and their larger loggias and garden areas, there were also these other kinds of opportunities that were inherently very theatrical. They were scripted. They had allegory. Medici weddings. So I think that it was more present than we understand it, in part because how we often experience the work is separated from its context or it's lost.
Do you have any other questions from the audience?
They've all been converted.
Any further from our speakers? Okay. Virginia, did you have anything else to say? Then thank you to everyone.
All right. Well, that's actually a perfect timing because, as I said, the exhibition galleries will be open until 5:30. And you've got enough time to go through the front of the museum. You can walk out here and across to the Museum of Art and go through the front doors as John and Mable intended you to do. So we invite you to do that. All right, and thank you all for being here today.